12 terrifying seconds in a luxury jewelry store. Tears flow as a young girl is falsely accused by the very police officer she trusted. How did the officer set a trap for her? And what secret left the entire court stunned? A bustling afternoon in central London, the streets teeming with shoppers, the sound of car horns and footsteps blending together to create a symphony of the city that never sleeps. Sophie Taylor, a 12-year-old girl with soft, curly brown hair, walked beside her best friend, Emily Clark. The two girls were still in their school uniforms, their gray pleated skirts slightly wrinkled after a long day. Sophie didn't pay much attention to her appearance, but as they walked through the luxurious streets, surrounded by women dressed in elegant gowns and men in expensive suits, she suddenly felt out of place. Emily chattered away about the latest movie she'd just watched, but Sophie's attention was drawn to a shop by the sidewalk. Regal Gems, London's most prestigious jewelry store. Its transparent glass windows displayed an array of sparkling treasures beneath warm, golden lights, brilliant diamonds, sapphire necklaces as deep blue as the ocean's tears, intricate rings that Sophie couldn't even dream of owning in a lifetime. Emily gasped, pointing to a stunning sapphire necklace in the center of the display. "I bet it's worth a fortune," she exclaimed excitedly. Sophie laughed along, but for some reason, a strange feeling crept into her chest. She had never stepped into a place like this, never touched the dazzling world that seemed to be reserved for another class of people. Looking at her wrinkled uniform reflected in the glass, Sophie suddenly realized how out of place she felt in such a luxurious setting. Inside the store, the women glanced at the two girls standing outside. An older woman draped in an expensive silk scarf furrowed her brow and then turned away, casting a cold glance. The shop assistant behind the counter briefly paused, her eyes flashing with a hint of suspicion. Sophie could feel it clearly, like a cold breeze brushing her neck. For a moment, she felt a growing discomfort, not because they weren't welcomed, but because it seemed as though everyone had already made a judgment about their presence. Emily didn't seem to notice. She was still eagerly pressing her face against the glass, admiring the lavish jewelry. But Sophie felt differently. An unsettling feeling lingered in her, as if she were standing at an invisible boundary, and with just one wrong step, everything could change forever. Just as Sophie was about to suggest they leave, the shop door suddenly opened. A middle-aged woman with her blonde hair neatly tied back, in an elegant black dress, stepped out. She glanced at the two girls with a discerning look, her eyes quickly assessing them. She didn't say anything, merely stood there for a moment before turning back inside. But the way she looked at them, neither curious nor interested but with a cold judgment, made Sophie feel suffocated. A voice echoed in her mind, "I shouldn't be here." But Emily thought otherwise. "Come on, let's go in for a bit. Just to look." She tugged at Sophie's hand, her eyes bright as though she had discovered a new world. Sophie hesitated but eventually followed her friend. The heavy glass door closed behind them, creating a barrier between the outside world and the opulence of Regal Gems. And from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The air inside Regal Gems suddenly grew thick, as if someone had turned the volume of life down to its lowest setting. Sophie could feel it the moment she stepped inside. The magnificent surroundings, once shimmering with the beauty of priceless jewels, now felt like a stage where every pair of eyes was fixed on her and Emily. The chatter of customers, the soft clink of jewelry trays being set on the glass counters, all of it slowed down, fading into a blur like a fog settling over everything. But there was one thing sharper than ever: the stairs. Margaret Evans, the owner, stood behind the display counter, silently observing. A woman of power, she had dealt with many wealthy clients. But the moment her gaze landed on Sophie, something shifted in her. Her eyes narrowed slightly, her head tilted, and her look turned cold. What were kids like these doing here? A place like Regal Gems wasn't meant for the curious, especially not for poor, misbehaving children. Frustration crept into her, an invisible yet rising sense of caution. Her hand tightened around the phone on the counter, and she leaned over, whispering to one of the staff, "Keep an eye on them." Emily, still lost in her excitement, pressed her face against the display glass, eyes sparkling as she admired the gems. Sophie stood beside her, her hand instinctively resting on the edge of the glass. A careless gesture, but it immediately sparked a wave of suspicion. A young staff member dressed in a neat uniform quickly moved closer. Another nodded at Margaret, as if confirming that they were monitoring every move of the two girls. Everything happened so subtly, but Sophie could clearly sense the shift in the atmosphere. Suddenly, a customer, a woman draped in a fur coat, passed by the girls. Her eyes quickly flicked over them, and she scoffed audibly before turning away. Sophie clenched her hands, an uncomfortable feeling spreading through her body. She hadn't done anything wrong, hadn't touched anything except the glass, but she could feel the weight of the stairs piercing through her, an invisible sensation but heavy, as if the whole space was closing in, pushing her into a corner. Emily continued to gush. "Sophie, look at this necklace. It's gorgeous." But Sophie no longer cared. She felt like she couldn't breathe. When she glanced toward the cashier, she caught Margaret's eyes, cold, sharp, like a blade brushing against her skin. Then Margaret slowly picked up her phone and dialed a number. Sophie couldn't hear what she said, but the sense of unease suddenly surged within her. Like a small animal wandering into a predator's territory, she could feel that a storm was closing in. The atmosphere in the store suddenly grew thick, a heavy silence enveloping the space, as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something horrifying to happen. And then it came. A loud scream pierced through the air from the display counter. "The sapphire necklace is gone." The staff nearby immediately froze, their faces displaying shock and disbelief. A middle-aged woman, probably the shift manager, rushed to the glass case where the necklace had been just moments ago. She unlocked it, checked carefully, then turned back to Margaret Evans with a look of panic. Margaret immediately waved her hand, signaling to an employee, "Check the cameras now." Her voice wasn't frantic, but cold, as if she had anticipated this. Sophie stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The unease that had slowly been building up earlier now erupted into a storm of panic. Emily still didn't understand what was happening, but when she saw Sophie's expression, she too took a step back instinctively. The staff member hurried to the security monitor, quickly scrolling through the footage. But then a statement made the entire store fall silent. "Mrs. Evans, the cameras malfunctioned. There's no footage of the necklace." Sophie felt a cold shiver run down her spine. A malfunction? How could this be such a coincidence? She turned to Emily, hoping to find reassurance in her friend's eyes, but Emily could only stand there, mouth agape, unable to say a word. And then the store door swung open. A man in a police uniform walked in, tall with short brown hair, a sharp, angular face, and eyes as cold as ice. Officer James Carter. He glanced over the crowd, and then locked his gaze onto Sophie. In that moment, Sophie felt as though she had been frozen in place, not because of fear, but because she felt like she had just become the hunted. Carter stepped forward, his voice not loud, but powerful enough for everyone to hear. "Open your backpack." Sophie jumped, her eyes wide, her mouth slightly open but unable to speak. The sound of her heart pounding in her ears drowned out everything else. She turned to Emily, but her best friend could only stand still, as helpless as Sophie. "I said, open your backpack," Carter repeated, his voice lower, more dangerous. All eyes in the store were now on Sophie. There was no way out. Sophie swallowed hard, her small hand gripping the zipper of her old backpack. She took a deep breath, hoping this was just a cruel joke, that when she opened it, there would be nothing out of the ordinary. But there it was. The sapphire necklace lay glittering on top of Sophie's pile of books. The entire store went deathly silent. A long moment of stillness passed, as though someone had thrown a bomb into the room, and everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the next explosion. Then the first sound broke the silence, a sharp intake of breath from someone in the crowd, followed by whispers. Sophie felt her body freeze. Her head spun, her breath short, as though someone had just struck her chest. She didn't understand what was happening. "No, I didn't take it. I swear," Sophie screamed, her voice breaking with fear. Her eyes welled up, her throat tight, as if something was blocking her from speaking further. But James Carter only smirked, his cold eyes unwavering. "Who do you think will believe you?" That sentence cut into Sophie like a blade. She looked around desperately, searching for a look of trust, a hand to help, but all she saw were suspicious stares, faces turning away. Margaret Evans stood with her arms crossed, her eyes cold, and filled with satisfaction. One of the employees bent down and whispered, shaking their head, "I knew it." You could tell what kind of person she was just by looking at her. Emily, Sophie's closest friend, stood there, frozen like stone. Sophie felt as if she were sinking deeper into a nightmare, a trap she hadn't even realized she had walked into. She hadn't done anything wrong. She hadn't done anything wrong. But now, no one believed that. The sound of car horns echoed faintly from outside, but inside the police station, there was nothing but a chilling silence. Sophie was forcefully pushed into the interrogation room, her small hands still trembling from everything that had just happened. She couldn't remember how many times she had cried on the way here, couldn't recall how she had tried to explain herself when they forced her into the police car. It was all in vain. No one believed her. Officer James Carter made that clear the moment he dragged Sophie out of Regal Gems, right in front of the scornful stares. He didn't ask any questions, didn't need to investigate. Sophie only remembered how he pulled her along, his cold eyes like a predator that had cornered its prey. Emily had screamed, but no one listened. No one stepped in to protect her. Sophie didn't know how long she had been sitting there. All she knew was that every second felt like an eternity. Her heart pounded as the door to the interrogation room swung open. Carter walked in, holding a thin file, slamming it onto the table. He didn't sit down, just crossed his arms in front of his chest, his sharp gaze locked on Sophie, as if she were a criminal trapped in the corner. "Well then, little girl, are you ready to confess now?" Carter's voice rang out, dripping with sarcasm. Sophie looked up, her eyes red and swollen, her voice choked. "I didn't steal the necklace. I swear." Carter chuckled quietly, shaking his head as though he had heard this exact phrase too many times before. "You think anyone's going to believe you?" He leaned closer, his voice dropping lower, as if whispering a deadly secret. "The cameras malfunctioned. There's no other evidence. We found the necklace in your backpack. That's all the court needs." Sophie felt a shiver run down her spine. No, this couldn't be happening. Someone had set her up. She clearly remembered when she opened her backpack. Her panic had been real. She hadn't had that necklace before. But now, no one cared about that. Carter tilted his head, slowly walking around the table like a predator savoring the fear of its prey. "If you don't confess, you'll have to spend the night in a holding cell." He stopped, smirking. "A little girl like you has probably never been through something like this, huh? It's going to be cold. Oh, and you'll meet all sorts of people in there." A wave of terror rose in Sophie's throat. Her breathing became erratic, waves of shivers running through her body. But she couldn't do anything but bite her lip, trying not to break down in front of him. Carter motioned toward the door. "Take her in." The sound of handcuffs clinking echoed as another officer stepped in. Sophie struggled instinctively, but their rough hands held her tight. She was dragged out, her legs stumbling as though she had fallen into another world, a place where justice didn't exist, where people were convicted before they were even tried. The sound of the cell door slamming shut was cold and sharp, like a blade cutting through everything left in Sophie's heart. She collapsed onto the floor, her knees pulled tight to her chest, each breath coming out in shaky gasps. Everything felt so foreign, so harsh. The gray brick walls around her seemed to tighten, trapping her in a place with no way out. There were no more sounds of Emily, no more busy streets outside, just the hollow echo of injustice. Outside the bars, Carter stood there, his gaze fixed on Sophie with a smug, disgusted smile. "You don't stand a chance, kid," he said slowly, firmly, like a sentence already passed. Sophie just clenched her fists, trying not to let the tears fall. But deep down, she knew one thing. This wasn't just an unreasonable punishment. It was a nightmare, perfectly staged. Sophie gritted her teeth, her eyes glistening with tears, but no longer just from pure fear. She couldn't keep crying. She couldn't let herself be crushed by a system that had already decided her fate without any justice. But no matter how hard she tried to stay strong, no matter how much she tried not to break down, Sophie was still just a 12-year-old, locked in a cold cell. And for the first time in her life, she understood what true helplessness felt like. Sophie sat motionless on the cold, hard bench of the cell, her small hands clutching her knees tightly, her empty eyes fixed on the cold gray wall in front of her. She had no idea how many hours had passed since she had been thrown in here. Everything felt like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Her sleep was fitful, interrupted by the echoing footsteps from the hallway, the crude voices of other prisoners in the nearby cells, all blending together into an endless noise that made her head feel heavier by the minute. Then the steel door creaked open. A guard entered, his face impassive, as if this was just another monotonous task. "Someone's calling for you," he said curtly, not even sparing Sophie a glance. Sophie jumped up, her heart racing as she followed him out. When they reached the phone room, Sophie noticed the public telephone in the corner, its wires twisted together, the wooden table beside it scratched in several places. But none of that mattered. The voice on the other end was what she was desperately waiting for. A police officer stood behind her, watching Sophie's every move as though she might try to escape right then and there. Sophie picked up the receiver, her breath catching in her throat when she heard the familiar voice. "Sophie, my dear?" Just hearing her mother's voice made Sophie lose control. Tears streamed down her face, her throat choking with emotion, her sobs rising and falling with each ragged breath. She clutched the phone tightly, as if holding it would keep her from feeling so alone. "Mom, Mom, please," her voice trembled, broken between sobs. On the other end of the line, Anna Taylor was crying too. "Are you okay? Are they doing anything to you? I'm so sorry I couldn't come right away. I've been trying everything." Her voice was filled with helplessness and despair. She had been running around for hours, trying everything she could to see her daughter, but everything was denied with the excuse of under investigation. "Mom, I didn't take it. I didn't do anything. I swear, Mom." Sophie nearly screamed, desperate to make her mother understand. She couldn't bear the thought that even her own mother might doubt her. "I know, my love. I believe you. I won't let this happen. The lawyer's on his way. I swear I'll do everything I can to get you out of there." But before Sophie could respond, a rough hand yanked the receiver away. "Time's up." The guard slammed the phone down without even glancing at Sophie. A cold, metallic click echoed through the room. Sophie stood still, her small hand gripping the edge of the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wanted to scream, to struggle, to pound on the iron door, hoping it would open so she could run home. But all she could do was stare at the lifeless phone, feeling as though the whole world was slowly swallowing her whole. She was trapped in a system that gave her no chance to speak, no right to explain herself. She was just a number in a police file, a name in tomorrow's newspaper, a sentence already decided. And now, even her mother's voice couldn't break through the invisible wall that kept her from escaping this place. A wave of anger surged inside Sophie. It wasn't just fear or sadness anymore. It was fury at the injustice that was crushing her and her family. She couldn't let this continue. But how could a 12-year-old child stand against a system that had already decided to bury her from the start? The sky over London was bleak, heavy clouds hanging low as if signaling a storm approaching. But the real storm didn't come from the weather. It came from what awaited Sophie inside the Royal Court of Justice. The police car stopped in front of the cold marble steps. The car door swung open, and immediately a barrage of flashbulbs rained down on the young girl. Sophie staggered as she stepped out, her eyes blinking rapidly, disoriented by the blinding lights. Hushed voices and hurried questions filled the air. "Sophie, do you have anything to say?" A reporter rushed forward, microphone raised. "Why did you do it? Did anyone help you?" Another voice cut in. Sophie felt as if those questions weren't really waiting for an answer. They already had their story, and she was just a part of it. Two officers flanked her on each side, escorting her through the press barricade. Across the street, a crowd had gathered, some holding signs that read boldly, "Punish the thief." A middle-aged man with a face full of disdain shouted, "Bring justice back to the righteous." Sophie's throat tightened. She hadn't done anything, but no one cared. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was so heavy it felt like it could suffocate her. Sophie sat down on the defendant's bench, her small hands clutching the armrest, trying to steady her breathing. She couldn't look at her mother, Anna Taylor, sitting just behind the family section, her hands tightly interwoven, her face etched with worry. Sophie felt completely alone. She didn't belong here. The sound of a chair scraping against the wooden floor broke through her thoughts. Prosecutor Henry Brooks, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and gold-rimmed glasses, stood up. He slowly walked to the center of the room, sighing as if he were dealing with an unfortunate, yet obvious matter. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his voice echoed, formal but dripping with sarcasm. "We are here today for a crime. A child, only 12 years old, has stolen a piece of jewelry worth thousands of pounds." Sophie lowered her head, her small shoulders trembling. Each word from Brooks felt like a knife slicing into her skin. She felt as though the entire world was turning against her, every eye in the room fixed on her, as though she were a small animal being hunted. Hunted. She wanted to scream, to tell them all she hadn't done anything wrong. But who would believe her? Prosecutor Brooks turned to the jury, his sharp eyes scanning each one. "This is not just a theft. This is a test of justice. If we let actions like this go unpunished, what will become of the order of our society?" He nodded towards someone behind him. Sophie didn't need to turn to know it was Officer James Carter, the man who had thrown her into this nightmare. Sophie bit her lip until it nearly bled. She couldn't let them continue like this. But when she looked up, all she saw were strange faces, people who had decided her fate the moment she stepped into this room. Her hands clenched tightly, her chest feeling as though it were being crushed by an invisible weight. No one was listening to her. No one at all. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become so tense it felt as though it could be sliced into pieces. The light from the chandelier overhead reflected off the glossed wood of the table. But no matter how luxurious this place appeared, Sophie felt as if she were trapped in an endless nightmare. Prosecutor Henry Brooks stood at the center of the room, his sharp gaze sweeping over everyone before pointing directly at Sophie. "Look at this girl," his voice rang out, loud and clear, each word seeming to carve itself into the minds of the jury. "She may be small, but theft knows no age. Crime is not measured by height or age. If we don't act now, how many more children will think they can roam free outside the law?" A surge of anger welled up in Sophie, so powerful that she felt her small hands clench instinctively. No one was listening to her. No one cared whether she was truly guilty or not. They just wanted an easy story, a criminal they could easily point the finger at. James Carter nodded, a slight smirk curling his lips as if he was savoring every moment of this. A smug, dirty sense of victory was written all over his face, the face of someone who knew they had power, someone who could twist the truth to their will. What had he said to Sophie the night before? "You don't have a chance." And now he was proving it. Sophie felt her body trembling with fury. She turned to look at her lawyer, Olivia Bennett, a young woman with curly brown hair and eyes full of determination. Sophie whispered, her voice low but heavy with weight, "They're lying." Olivia didn't respond immediately. She bent down, gripping Sophie's cold hand tightly in hers. It was a small gesture, but it conveyed a powerful message. "I believe you." Sophie bit her lip, her eyes welling up but not letting a single tear fall. She couldn't cry. She couldn't let them see her weakness. But the anger inside her was boiling, mixed with a sense of helplessness that she couldn't scream out in a room full of people who had already made up their minds. Outside the courtroom, a virulent wave of outrage was also rising. The audience watching the case unfold through the media, those who understood this wasn't just a petty theft, it was a power game meant to crush an innocent 12-year-old girl. And the audacity of James Carter only made them want to shout for Sophie. Where is the justice? The silence in the courtroom was taut, like the string of a bow about to snap. Every eye was fixed on Olivia Bennett as she stood up, her black suit neat and sharp, her gaze as keen as a blade ready to cut through the facade of this trial. Olivia walked slowly toward the center of the room, took a deep breath, and then spoke. "Officer Carter," she said, her tone low but filled with authority, each word resonating through the space. "Why was the security camera at Regal Gems turned off right at the most crucial moment?" All eyes turned toward James Carter. He sat there, his hands clasped together on the table, his earlier confidence beginning to waver. A brief moment of hesitation flickered in his eyes. It was just a second, but Olivia saw it. Sophie saw it, and the entire courtroom saw it. "I don't know," Carter answered, his voice slightly hesitant, but he quickly regained his composure. He didn't want to show weakness in front of the public, but that moment of uncertainty was the first crack in his armor. Olivia smiled lightly. "You don't know?" she repeated, emphasizing each word. Then she turned and clasped her hands behind her back, as though contemplating something. Then she turned back to face Carter, her eyes lighting up like a hawk that had just spotted its prey. "Then let me ask you another question. If Sophie didn't put the necklace into her backpack, then who did?" The courtroom erupted. A wave of murmurs spread through the room. The jury exchanged looks, reporters frantically jotted down notes, and spectators in the gallery began to whisper. This question had shifted the entire dynamic. Sophie lifted her head, a spark of hope flickering inside her. She looked at Olivia, then around the courtroom. For the first time since the trial had begun, she felt something other than despair. But James Carter only sneered, a dangerous smile. "You're trying to turn the tables, Ms. Bennett," he said, his tone calm, but his eyes darkening. "But the truth remains. We found the necklace in the defendant's backpack. That doesn't change anything." Sophie clenched her fists. Olivia, however, didn't take her eyes off Carter. But instead of showing anger, she wore a thin, knowing smile. "Well then, let's see," Olivia said, her voice bright with the hint of discovery. "If the truth is truly unchangeable." The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The real battle had begun. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted suddenly, as though the air itself had thickened. The tension that had initially been drawn from the heavy accusations hurled by prosecutor Henry Brooks now seemed to move towards something darker. The strange, unsettling silence of James Carter. He remained seated, his hands clasped in front of him, the once confident air about him beginning to waver. His eyes were dark, but the look in them hinted at something breaking, some crack in the veneer he had so carefully built. The door to the courtroom opened with a soft creak, and a middle-aged man stepped in. His neat gray suit was impeccable, his hair slightly graying at the temples, yet his eyes were sharp and professional, betraying a sense of someone who had long been in the business of handling contentious cases. Olivia Bennett stood poised and confident, addressing the jury with an air of determination. "Your Honor, I call the next witness, Mr. David Harris, a legal video analysis expert with over 20 years of experience." David Harris walked up to the witness stand, his movements deliberate and composed. He opened his briefcase, extracting a small hard drive, which he plugged into the courtroom's large screen. The courtroom fell silent in anticipation as the screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, compromised by the poor lighting, but it was enough. The footage from the Regal Gems security camera began to play. The image was shaky, but the figure was unmistakable, taller than Sophie. Someone was seen rushing out of the store, their coat concealing something beneath it. The room erupted into hushed murmurs, and Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Olivia, ever composed, took a deliberate step forward, her voice calm but laced with undeniable intent. "Mr. Harris, can you confirm this?" David Harris nodded slowly, his tone confident and steady. "I've reviewed the footage thoroughly and analyzed every frame. I can confirm this. The person in the video is not Sophie Taylor. Based on the height and build, the individual in question is at least 10 to 15 centimeters taller than the defendant. This indicates the necklace was removed from the store before Officer James Carter even arrived on the scene." Sophie's heart skipped a beat, her eyes wide as the truth she had known all along was spoken aloud for the world to hear. She was innocent, but for the first time, someone, an expert in the field, had spoken up clearly, authoritatively, without a shadow of doubt. Sophie dared to lift her head, the faintest glimmer of hope appearing in her eyes. It was the first time since entering the courtroom that she felt something other than despair. But James Carter remained eerily still. There was no visible reaction, no anger, no objection. He simply sat there, staring at the screen, his expression as cold as ever. It was as though he already knew this. Sophie's eyes flickered over to him, the knot in her stomach tightening. She felt a weight in her chest, a mix of confusion, disbelief, and mounting frustration. If he truly believed she was guilty, why wasn't he challenging this? Why wasn't he fighting to discredit the footage? His silence seemed to confirm something more sinister. The room began to hum with a low, uncomfortable murmur. Why wasn't Carter defending his stance? Why wasn't he doing everything in his power to challenge the video evidence? The tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the courtroom itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. Olivia, unfazed and steady as ever, turned her gaze to Carter. Her voice, when she spoke, was no longer calm but sharp, demanding answers. "Officer Carter, do you still believe Sophie Taylor is the thief?" The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. The bated silence stretched on, the question hanging in the air like a weight that no one dared to ignore. But Carter didn't answer. His jaw tightened, his hands gripping the edge of the table in a way that only emphasized his growing discomfort. The silence stretched on, and the weight of his hesitation felt like an answer in itself. It was then that the world inside the courtroom seemed to tilt. Sophie, the one who had been labeled guilty from the beginning, now found herself with the greatest hope. Her heart raced, not because the battle was over, but because for the first time, she felt like there was someone who believed in her. But even as hope flared inside her, there was still a nagging question, an uncomfortable sense of doubt that gnawed at the edges of her victory. Why was Carter silent? What was he hiding? His refusal to respond, his unwillingness to defend his position, spoke volumes. Had he truly believed Sophie was guilty all along? Or was he now struggling to maintain the facade he had so carefully constructed? The jury exchanged uncomfortable glances, the tension palpable. The courtroom was now divided. Those who had once viewed Sophie with suspicion were beginning to question their own conclusions. The very foundation of Carter's accusations was beginning to crumble, and all it took was his silence to reveal the cracks in his story. Olivia Bennet, with the calm precision of a strategist, had turned the tables, and now the battle for truth had truly begun. A heavy silence descended on the courtroom. Every eye was on James Carter, the man who had been behind all the accusations leveled at Sophie from the very beginning. The evidence was now stacked against him, and for the first time, he was facing real questions. Carter stood, adjusting his tie, exuding an annoyingly smug confidence. He glanced around as though assessing the reactions of the jury before speaking. His voice was smooth, unwavering. I was just doing my job. When I arrived, the necklace was in the girl's backpack. I had no reason to doubt that. But, he paused deliberately, allowing a moment of silence to draw attention. Perhaps someone placed it there by mistake. An unfortunate misunderstanding. Mistake? A simmering wave of indignation swept through the courtroom. Some jurors raised their eyebrows, and murmurs rippled through the spectators. Sophie felt her anger rising, burning in her chest. Mistake? That's how he was explaining how a 12-year-old child was treated like a criminal, dragged out of a store in humiliation, imprisoned in fear for days. Olivia Bennet crossed her arms, her eyes sharper than ever. She took a step forward, her voice cold and cutting. Mistake? An unfortunate misunderstanding, Officer Carter? Or is this a setup? Carter shrugged, still wearing a calm, almost indifferent expression, as though none of this mattered. He neither denied nor refuted the accusation. He remained silent, as if his words or silence made no difference in the outcome. Frustration exploded in that moment. The entire courtroom felt like it wanted to shout. Those watching the trial through the media were grinding their teeth in anger. This wasn't just a blatant lie. This was an outright manipulation. Sophie stared at Carter, her hands clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She had endured enough. She couldn't let him stand there, shrugging as if he had nothing to do with this nightmare. Olivia took a deep breath, her voice like a knife. You're not denying it. She paused, locking eyes with Carter, challenging him. You knew exactly what you were doing from the start, didn't you? Carter smirked, neither confirming nor denying. But just that alone was enough to make the entire courtroom want to strike his emotionless face. The silence in the courtroom grew so heavy it felt like even the air had thickened. Everyone was waiting for a response from James Carter, an excuse, an apology, or at least some sense of accountability. But no, he just stood there, calm to the point of being detestable. Sophie stared at him intently. She no longer felt fear. The fear had been replaced by disappointment and hurt. Sophie's eyes were brimming, not from fear, but from the pain of realizing that the man she had once trusted could be so ruthless. Her voice trembled, but each word cut sharply. I thought you were a good man. The courtroom was shaken. Those simple words held more weight than any argument. They weren't just an accusation but a betrayal, spoken in the voice of a child, painful yet honest. James Carter flinched slightly. He turned his face away instinctively, as if he didn't want to face Sophie's gaze. But he couldn't hide the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He could lie in court. He could be brazen in front of the jury, but he couldn't be shameless in front of a child he had pushed into hell. Olivia Bennet said nothing. She knew that there were no words stronger than the look in Sophie's eyes right now. The entire courtroom was silent, no longer the tension of a trial, but the silence of truth that had just been uncovered. Outside the courtroom, the spectators following the case through the media felt a rising wave of anger. No one could sit still witnessing this. No one wanted to see a child suffer like this just because the legal system had turned her into a sacrificial lamb. Sophie didn't need cheap excuses, she needed justice. And for the first time, the audience wanted justice for her more than ever. The courtroom exploded into an unprecedented frenzy. No one had anticipated that the truth would come to light in this way. Sarah Miles, a sales associate from Regal Gems, took the witness stand. She looked nervous, her hands clasped tightly together, her breath quick and uneven, but her gaze was steadfast. This was no mere casual statement. It was a confession, an undeniable blow to the system that seemed invincible. "I saw Officer Carter holding the necklace before he checked the girl's backpack," Sarah said, her voice shaking yet unwavering. The room erupted in chaos. The sound of whispered shock and gasps spread like wildfire. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed looks, their expressions filled with disbelief. The audience in the gallery murmured in outrage, and reporters frantically scribbled down notes. The weight of the words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Olivia Bennett, composed as always, stepped forward with an almost imperceptible smile of triumph. She didn't need to say a word. The truth had finally pierced through the falsehoods. Carter, already on edge, stood up abruptly, his face turning crimson, his hands slamming down onto the table with a force that made the entire room flinch. "She's lying," he bellowed, his eyes wild, his voice cracking with desperation. He looked like an animal that had been cornered, ready to pounce or flee but unable to escape the inevitable. But Sarah didn't waver. She swallowed hard, her gaze unwavering as she turned to face the jury, her voice, though still trembling, now filled with conviction. "I'm not lying. Margaret paid him to do this." The air in the courtroom instantly froze. A stunned silence fell over the room. Time itself seemed to pause. This wasn't just a corrupt cop anymore. It was a well-orchestrated conspiracy, a corrupt system designed to crush an innocent child. The trial that was supposed to judge Sophie's guilt or innocence had now shifted entirely. It wasn't about a necklace. It was about the abuse of power, the manipulation of justice, and the deliberate targeting of someone who could not fight back. Sophie's heart raced, her hands clenched into tight fists, her nails digging into her palms. She had known all along that she was innocent, but hearing the truth spoken out loud, so clearly, so definitively, made her heart swell with emotion. James Carter stood there, shaking with rage, but he didn't back down. Instead, he looked like a man desperate to keep his lies intact, to hold on to whatever shred of authority he could still claim. "This doesn't change anything," he shouted, his voice trembling with uncontainable fury. "There's no proof. It's just a lie. It doesn't matter what she says." His face was a mask of denial and deflection, but beneath it, there was a flicker of fear, a brief, fleeting moment of doubt. The calm and unshakable confidence that had defined him up until now was crumbling, and Sophie could feel it. Sophie's mind spun. She had been dragged through hell, accused of something she didn't do, and now she finally saw the system starting to crack. This wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about exposing a far bigger truth. But the real shock wasn't Carter's desperate outburst. It was the quiet that followed. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't filled with tension from accusations. Instead, it was suffused with something else, a truth that everyone could feel but no one could deny. Olivia Bennett, ever the strategist, remained calm. Her eyes didn't flicker with surprise or emotion, but there was a subtle glint of something more powerful, certainty. She didn't need to yell, to argue, or to force anyone to listen. She simply turned her gaze toward Carter, the weight of her words undeniable. "So, you're still not denying it, Officer Carter?" She paused, allowing the full impact of the statement to sink in before continuing, her voice sharp as a blade. "You knew exactly what you were doing from the beginning, didn't you?" For a brief, unbearable moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. Every eye was on Carter. This was it, the moment where his facade would finally crumble. But he didn't respond. Instead, his jaw clenched, his fists tightened at his sides, and his silence spoke louder than any words could have. He had no answer. Carter's refusal to answer wasn't just a sign of guilt. It was an admission that he knew exactly what he had done. He had manipulated everything: the investigation, the arrest, the trial, all to protect himself and those he served. The tide had turned. The power that Carter had wielded over Sophie was no longer his to hold. The courtroom, once filled with doubt and suspicion, was now electric with the charge of truth. Outside the courthouse, the media storm was swelling. Anger and disbelief were rippling through the audience as they realized they had been watching a farce from the start. This wasn't a simple case of theft. It was a deliberate manipulation of the legal system to cover up a crime. And now, for the first time, justice had a chance to finally emerge from the shadows. Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't over, not yet. But for the first time, she wasn't alone anymore. She didn't have to fight the world by herself. And as the courtroom settled into a tense silence, the true battle for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was like a storm on the verge of eruption. The walls that had once protected Carter were now crumbling, piece by piece. Carter stood there, his face pale, sweat pouring down his forehead. He swallowed hard, trying to maintain his composure, but everyone could see the panic gnawing at him. Olivia Bennett wasn't giving him the chance to escape. She took a step forward, her gaze sharp as a blade, ready to tear apart every lie. "Who paid you?" Her voice rang out clearly, full of authority. Was it Margaret Evans? Or someone else? Carter opened his mouth, but no words came out. He had no way out. The jury watched in stunned silence. The reporters in the courtroom began furiously taking notes, fully aware that they were witnessing a moment that could change everything. Sophie held her breath, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. She had waited for this moment far too long. Bam! The sound of Judge Thomas Reed's gavel echoed loudly. "Officer Carter, answer the question immediately." His voice thundered, leaving no room for any further evasion. Carter flinched, his shoulders stiffening. He glanced around the room, but this time there was no one left to cling to. Margaret Evans wasn't there to protect him. Prosecutor Henry Brooks was slowly retreating, clearly not wanting to be entangled with someone sinking deeper into the muck. He had been abandoned. Carter's lips moved, but still, no words came out. Finally, he bowed his head. The room seemed to freeze. No one spoke a word, but everyone understood that it was a sign of his collapse. The frustration still lingered. Why had it taken so long for justice to appear? But at that moment, hope truly began to shine. Sophie clenched her hands tighter, her heart pounding in her chest. She was about to be freed. But would the full truth be revealed? Or was this just the tip of the iceberg? The courtroom sank into an eerie silence. No more lies to justify, no more baseless accusations. All that remained was a deep, searing pain reflected in the eyes of a 12-year-old girl, a child who had just been through hell at the hands of those in power. Sophie stared at Carter, her small body trembling. Tears fell from her eyes, but this time they were not out of fear. They were born from the anguish, from the shattering realization that those who were supposed to protect her were the very ones who had destroyed her. "Why did you do this to me?" Her voice cracked, breaking with the weight of her sobs. Carter didn't answer. He couldn't. He couldn't face Sophie's eyes, couldn't confront the consequences of his actions. He only lowered his head, his shoulders shaking, perhaps from fear or perhaps from the remnants of a conscience that was slowly eating him alive. But it was too late. Anna Taylor, Sophie's mother, jumped to her feet from the gallery. She rushed to her daughter, pulling her into a tight embrace as if to shield her from all the hurt the world had inflicted on her. Her hands trembled, but that embrace was stronger than any words could have been. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. I promise." Sophie buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her tears soaking through the fabric of her mother's clothes. She didn't need to know if Carter regretted it. No apology could ever make up for what she had endured. But at least now, she didn't have to face it alone anymore. The courtroom was boiling over. It wasn't just outrage, it was a storm of defiance. The people present, the audience watching through the media, all understood that justice wasn't just about clearing Sophie's name. The child deserved reparation. She deserved to see those who had pushed her to the brink of destruction held accountable. And no one was willing to let this end here. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath, each second stretched with such tension that it felt as though the very air had thickened. Every eye was fixed on the jury, the people who had spent hours deliberating the fate of a 12-year-old girl. Sophie sat at the defendant's table, her small hands gripping her knees. She didn't dare to breathe too deeply, her heart pounding so hard in her chest it felt as though it might burst. Olivia Bennet sat beside her, one hand resting on Sophie's shoulder, offering the final strength Sophie needed in this decisive moment. A middle-aged woman, the foreperson of the jury, stood up, holding a small piece of paper. All eyes were locked on her. In the case before the Royal Court of Justice, the People versus Sophie Taylor, after reviewing all the evidence and testimony, we, the jury, find the defendant. The entire courtroom fell into a suffocating silence. Not guilty. Bam! The sound of applause erupted like thunder. Everyone stood up at once. A wave of emotion surged through the courtroom as cheers and shouts of joy echoed from the audience who had followed every tense moment of the trial. Justice had finally prevailed. Sophie's mouth hung open as though she couldn't believe her ears. Tears streamed down her face. But this time, they were no longer tears of fear or helplessness. Olivia smiled brightly, pulling Sophie into a tight embrace. "You did it, Sophie. You fought, and you won." Anna Taylor, overcome with emotion, rushed to her daughter, pulling her into an embrace. The two of them clung to each other, trembling in each other's arms, but not from sorrow anymore, but because at last they were free. Yet amidst the joy that filled the room, there lingered a dark shadow. James Carter still stood there. He was pale, his eyes staring at the floor, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was no longer the one controlling the courtroom, no longer the one determining the fate of others. But he had not yet been punished. No one had forgotten what he had done, and no one would accept that he could walk out of this place without facing the consequences of his actions. The discomfort had not disappeared. Justice was not truly complete, and everyone knew that another battle remained. One to expose the full truth and ensure that the wrongdoers would not escape the consequences of their deeds. The courtroom had yet to settle after the verdict when a deep voice cut through the chaos. "Officer Carter, you will be investigated for fraud and abuse of power." Judge Thomas Reed fixed his sharp gaze on Carter, his eyes as cutting as a blade. There was no room for deceit now. A police officer stepped forward, slapping handcuffs on Carter right before everyone's eyes. He stumbled back reflexively, his face ashen, his eyes wide with panic, as if he just realized that there was no escape for him anymore. A ripple of murmurs filled the room. Some people smiled in satisfaction, but the anger had not fully dissipated. Justice may have started, but it was far from finished. Olivia Bennet stood with her arms crossed, her gaze offering Carter no sympathy. "The truth always finds a way to surface, no matter how hard you try to hide it," she said softly, but just loud enough for Carter to hear. But Carter wasn't the only one who would have to answer for what had happened. Another man walked into the room, handing a file to the judge. "Your Honor, Margaret Evans, the owner of Regal Gems, will be summoned for investigation for complicity in the fraud and providing false testimony." Margaret, the woman who had orchestrated this entire charade from the shadows, now had nowhere left to hide. The frustration that had simmered in the room began to ease as people realized those behind the scheme would finally face the consequences. But would the punishment be enough to compensate for the suffering they had caused? A few days after the trial, Regal Gems issued a public apology. A long article appeared in major news outlets, filled with flowery language about an unfortunate misunderstanding and a commitment to fairness and transparency. But Sophie silently held the printed apology, staring at it for a few seconds before tearing it into small pieces. Anna Taylor looked at her daughter, a pain too deep to express filling her heart. "Sophie, are you okay?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Sophie didn't look up. She simply replied quietly but with finality, "They're not sincere." Anna said nothing more, simply wrapping her arms around her daughter. This apology didn't come from regret. It came from fear of the public's backlash. Sophie knew this, and she would not accept this insincerity. The people who caused all of this might be starting to face consequences, but justice had not yet been fully served. The desire to resist still lingered, not just for Sophie, but for all those who had been trampled by this system. And this time, she would not remain silent. The sky over London was overcast, the cold winds sweeping across the schoolyard. But inside the small auditorium of the high school, the atmosphere was charged with energy. A transformation was taking place. Sophie Taylor stood at the podium, no longer the trembling girl in the courtroom. Now she stood tall, her gaze unwavering and resolute. In front of her were dozens of students from different grades, all listening intently. Some were merely curious, others filled with admiration, but all could feel the determination in every word she spoke. I used to be afraid, but not anymore. Sophie's voice rang out, louder and clearer than any speaker system. I know what it feels like to be looked down upon, to be trampled on, to be forced into silence. But today, I stand here to say that none of us deserve to endure that. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in understanding. Others clenched their fists, remembering the times they had been wronged but were unable to fight back. They understood what Sophie was saying. Sophie took a deep breath, then looked directly into the faces before her. I don't want anyone else to go through what I've been through. I can't change the past, but I can change the future. Beside Sophie was a large banner with bold letters, Voice for Justice, the organization she had just founded within her very own school. The goal wasn't just to tell Sophie's story, but to give every other child a place to speak out. Applause started slow at first, then gradually spread like wildfire. Something had been ignited in that room. From a victim, Sophie had become a warrior. But deep in her mind, the memory still lingered. The wounds had not fully healed, and perhaps they would never truly disappear. But instead of letting them consume her, Sophie had turned them into the strength to fight. Justice was not just a verdict in a courtroom. Justice was a journey, and Sophie was ready to walk that path. Sophie sat at her desk, the soft yellow light casting a warm glow over the blank page before her. She picked up the pen, her fingers trembling slightly, but not from fear. It was the overwhelming emotions inside her that made her hands shake. She took a deep breath and began to write. Dear Olivia, I used to think that justice was something obvious, that if someone was innocent, they would be cleared, and if someone was guilty, they would be punished. But I was wrong. Justice doesn't come on its own, and it's not always fair. It only happens when someone is willing to fight for it. And you taught me that. Because of you, I've learned that silence cannot protect us, but speaking out can change an entire system. I am no longer the girl who was thrown into a cell, trembling with fear. I stood up. I fought. And now I want to help others do the same. Sophie paused, staring at the words she had written. She wasn't just writing to Olivia anymore. She was writing to herself, carving her journey into the page. She continued, her handwriting more confident now. Thank you for believing in me when no one else did. Thank you for fighting by my side. I promise I will not let injustice continue without someone standing up against it. When she finished the letter, Sophie carefully folded it, placed it into an envelope, and wrote the address on the front. But as she was about to leave the room, she paused for a moment, looking back at everything she had gone through. From a child wrongly accused, treated like a criminal, to someone who dared to stand up, who dared to fight for justice. She had grown through her own pain. Elsewhere, Olivia Bennett sat in her office, a steaming cup of tea beside her. When she opened Sophie's letter and read each line, a smile appeared on her face. This was no longer the fragile Sophie Taylor she had once protected. Justice hadn't come easily, but it had made this journey worthwhile. Justice is not a gift to be handed down. It is a battle that we must rise up and fight for. Sophie Taylor has proven that even a child can fight against injustice, as long as they have the courage to not bow down to fear. In life, there will be times when we feel overwhelmed, when we are forced to remain silent in the face of wrongdoing. But silence is never the solution. The lesson from Sophie's story is not just confined to the courtroom. It is present in every aspect of life. When you face injustice, remember that you have the right to speak up. When you see someone being oppressed, remember that justice only becomes real when there is someone brave enough to protect it. Not everyone has the opportunity to stand in court to prove their innocence, but every day we can choose to live with fairness, fight for the truth, and not turn a blind eye to the vulnerable. Justice is not a distant dream. It lies in the smallest actions you take every day. Don't let anyone tell you that you are too small to make a difference. The greatest fire starts from the smallest spark. Fear is the enemy of truth, but once you dare to face it, you will be stronger than anything that can crush you. Remember, the world does not change because of the silent ones. It changes because of those who dare to raise their voices. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. Sophie's story is not just about her fight for justice. It's a reminder that standing up for what is right is never easy, but it is always worth it. Your voice matters. Your courage can inspire change. If this story moved you, if you believe in the power of truth and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Join us as we continue to bring you powerful stories that challenge injustice and celebrate resilience. Together, we can amplify voices that deserve to be heard. See you in the next story.